This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jacinta Thompson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land we meet on today is Kaurna land. We wish to express our respect for the Kaurna people, their elders and ancestors, and acknowledge the spiritual and cultural relationship that they have with their traditional land. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight on behalf of the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia to hear from the wonderful Thomas Keneally AO in conversation with Professor Jason Bainbridge on the craft of writing. First of all, I just would like to acknowledge joining us tonight is Mr. Jim McDowell, Chancellor, University of South Australia, and Dr. Penny Moore, Director, Chancellery and Council Services, University of South Australia. And of course, a very warm welcome both to Thomas and Jason. The Hawke Centre is committed to delivering a free and diverse program of events and exhibitions throughout the year, which reflect our fundamental themes of strengthening our democracy, valuing our diversity, and building our future. So, on to introductions. Award-winning Australian author Thomas Keneally AO is one of Australia's most prolific and best-known novelists. As the multi-award-winning author of more than 30 novels, dramas, screenplays and books of non-fiction, he is also one of its most distinguished. In 1982, he won the Booker Prize for Schindler's Ark, which was made into the Academy Award-winning film Schindler's List. His novels, The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith, Gossip from the Forest and Confederates were all shortlisted for the Booker Prize, while Larks and Heroes won the Miles Franklin Award. Tonight, Thomas will be in conversation with Professor Jason Bainbridge, Head of School of Creative Industries at the University of South Australia. Previously, Jason was a key player at Swinburne University in Melbourne, where he was Chair of Media and Communication and Acting Dean of the School of Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities, helping to transform and energise media and arts education. He has a PhD in Cultural Studies from Queensland University, where he also completed his Bachelor of Arts Honours and Bachelor of Laws. So please join me in a very warm welcome to Thomas Keneally AO and Professor Jason Bainbridge. Thank you.
Thank you. Tom, tonight we're talking about the craft of writing, and I'm very conscious of the fact they've cruelly only given us an hour to discuss this when we've got a lot to cover. So I wanted to open with a quote from you to get to the heart of what writing is about. Everyone who wants to write knows that it's fun. They want to get into it because they know there's something transcendent about it that will enable them to rise above themselves. What's the most fun part about writing for you?
That intoxication of moving a world forward, a world that's entirely in your head, in some part of your head, it may even be in our communal mind out there, but that's getting into creepy music area. It might be our communal mind, it might be our shared mind. It is finding out about characters and about events, things you didn't know you knew. It's as transcendent as liquor, but no hangovers. Mind you, when you feel transcendent about it, when you feel that you feel, as you know, because you're a writer, that you've gone into the fireplace of the gods and you've nicked part of their fire and you've got out. And the exhilaration of that, when you're just an ordinary human, is tremendous. there might be some relief and therapy for the unconscious mind in it as well. Now, the other thing is it makes you feel miserable a lot of time, but it is that feeling that we're dealing with things that aren't, we're discovering things that aren't quite within our power, that we're entering a secret. We're entering things we didn't know we knew, to repeat that phrase. That is part of the intoxication of it all, yeah.
Your first published book was in '64, and you've essentially done a book a year since. That's a prodigious output. Is that part of the Irish Catholic upbringing that's led to that
That's
sort of
part
discipline?
of the feeling guilty for not writing, yeah. My parents were very industrious people. Being survivors of the Depression, they judged themselves by their work. Even though it was humble work, it was work that was beneath their intelligence, I've got to tell you. But they believed in the dignity of work and the virtue of industry. So they were tykes who had the Protestant work ethic. I remember even, I've had one big grant in my life, and it was before Gough Whitlam started the Australia Council. Menzies decided I wasn't a communist, so he gave $4,000 of a Commonwealth Literary Fund to me at a time when $4,000 was a craftsman's wage. And I wrote a book on that called Bring Larks and Heroes. And I remember approaching it that I owed the Australian taxpayer something for sacrificing their $4,000 to me. And I got those attitudes from my parents. You know, my parents who, when they were dying, my mother broke her pelvis in the mid-90s, was taken to hospital and died sadly there. She only broke her pelvis because she insisted on, she should have been at our place, but she insisted on living on her own. But when my wife called the ambulance, she said, "You shouldn't call an ambulance. Sick people are going to need it." And those attitudes were very strongly implanted in me, but not everyone can write a novel a year. You know, there are some novelists who are actually good and write a novel every 3 or 4 years. And there's Gustave Flaubert, who wrote a novel every 20 years or so. And so it's ultimately the quality that counts. But it's very interesting psychologically to me that every writer has a different time fuse and works at a different pace. For example, there are writers, my daughter who started writing, I've started writing detective stories with her. She is much faster than me. She's a former journo and she's got, really tears into it. And she wrote her own novel last year, and she wrote it in about 4 months. So somewhere between 4 months and 40 years is the right span within which to write a novel.
Do you remember what age you started writing, and who was it that inspired you at the time?
Oh yeah, it was other people my age in the audience might remember these times when we were taught nothing but English, mainland British literature. We called it all English literature, but half of it was written by Scots, Welsh, and Irish, of course. In any case, poetry ended with Tennyson, and the novel ended with Thomas Hardy. And if you're going to be a writer, you had to know all those nifty little flowers that grew in English hedgerows. And you had to have winter at the right time of year. So we felt geographically as well as culturally dealt out of the literary universe. So I was reading books like Biggles. I was reading Fenimore Cooper. The really good books that got to me were all hugely melodramatic, and I'm a bit of a melodrama queen myself. They were Walter Scott, Fenimore Cooper. I loved the Last of the Mohicans, and then the movie came out round about 1951, an old movie, and it had the most magnificent. It's not like the modern version, which is not up to scratch, even though it's got that great Irish actor in it, Daniel Day-Lewis. But when Uncas went to throw the heroine over the cliff in the original version, you really felt it, particularly if you were an innocent 13-year-old from Homebush and not exposed to the big world. And so I tended to write melodrama when I was young. And then I started to write poetry. I was telling the kids today, I was so bowled over by modern poetry that I thought it could actually pull girls. I wore a volume of modern poetry in my chest, in my breast pocket, quite confident that it would attract some girl to ask me what I had in there, and I could read her a poet she'd never encountered again. And on the strength of T.S. Eliot or Dylan Thomas, I could have a triumph. And I had told them, we take them into a garden of poetry and go all the way, which in 1951 meant holding hands. And so, yeah, I was definitely, and then at the same time, I encountered Graham Greene, and that I was away. When I studied in the seminary, incidentally, there was a bloke called Eddie Campion, who's still a priest. He's a great character in Sydney. Some of you may know about him. Fortunately, it's a funny thing, and this isn't relative to the court case at the moment. The man may be innocent for all we know, but all the priests I liked didn't get on with George Pell. But I don't know why that was so. They're all lefties and writers and poets. So we formed this literary society, but it was really the Graham Greene Society. And Graham Greene in the 1950s was considered very heterodox and risque for Catholics to read. There were actually sermons against his book. Now, that's where the priesthood has failed. They don't condemn books from the pulpit anymore. If only they condemn a few more, we'd have a bigger industry. But Eddie and I and Brian Johns left, he became Goff's press secretary. He became head of the ABC, head of SBS, publisher at Penguin, head of the Copyright Council, and died a few years ago. So we were literary lads together, you know, and looked upon as potential heretics, the sort of people who might write a book one day. Well, it turned out to be correct in Eddie's case, and mine. Johnsy was too busy publishing them to write them himself. But in any case, I had that typical literary childhood and youth, even though part of it was spent in a monastery. I hope that's not true of any of your undergraduates, that they have to escape a monastery.
Writer to published writer, when did you feel like you were comfortable calling yourself a novelist?
It's a funny thing. Some years ago, I did a reading in Calcutta with Kiran Desai, who wrote that magnificent book about the troubles in Kashmir. And she'd just been made She just won the Booker. And she said when she won the Booker, her first thought was, perhaps I am a novelist. Because you think you're getting away with murder. You know, you go to literary festivals and people treat you with respect and listen to you, and you think, this can't be right. She thought she might be a novelist after she'd won the Booker. But I presume to be established. It was an era in which Australians did all sorts of amazing things. Betty Cuthbert didn't know she would win a 400-metre medal from lane 8. No one ever wins a 400-metre gold medal from lane 8. But she didn't know any better because she was post-colonial Australian and she just did it, you know. And similarly, I didn't know you couldn't make a living as a writer. I hadn't been to the right schools. I didn't know, none of my uncles were on the board of directors of publishing companies. And indeed, writing as a craft was nearly invisible in Australia then. And it's so delightful to see the young students now who are going to try to pursue writing as a craft. And however they make a living, it doesn't matter as long as they pursue, you know, they might teach, they might write jingles, there are many things they might do, but they'll keep that dream of producing books and poetry and movies, etc. All those kids there today, some of them were director-producer. One of them introduced himself as a writer-director. And
Yes,
I thought that was great. I said, you'll never have trouble with scripts because you writing it yourself. You'll never have an unruly writer. And none of that was around. A kid who said that in my day would have been certified. And besides, he would have been told, that's not what we do, mate. We're foreign wars, fine wool, beating the Poms at cricket. That's what we do, mate. Leave writing fiction to the Poms. You know. Anyhow, the craft of writing was hard to build up at first. I think round about early 1970s, I felt that it was going to be what I did for the rest of my life. But I knew there would be liquidity problems. Being a novelist is very like being a primary producer. The royalties are paid irregularly, and twice a year if you're lucky. And so the big wool check doesn't come too often. And there are, I wish publishers under pressure from writers would pay up more regularly on a quarterly basis, say, so writers know what's happening to them tax-wise, and so they don't get a big amount and say, I'm made, and run forth and spend it all in 2 or 3 days. But that's an industrial matter. There was not even an industrial organisation or a craft organisation for writers. It was founded in 1963 by a couple of brave writers, including Morris West, the old Devil's Advocate man, who wrote The Devil's Advocate. He was one of the first Australian bestseller people. I mean, Neville Shute was too. But these people lived in England, and you had to go looking for Australian literary figures. And there was a strange man lived out in the outer suburbs called Patrick White. And there was a fellow who hung round the cross called Kenneth Slessor, and there was a beautiful squeaky-voiced genius called Judith Wright. And but they were not public figures in those days. There was no Tim Winton of the period, for example. So the craft of letters hadn't been established in Australia, and it was a thing of the 70s, I think.
There's a few things to explore out of that. I suppose the first one that interests me is that notion of fame. So with your third novel, you were thrust into the limelight, internationally recognised with the Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith, and then taken to probably another level with Schindler's Ark. What was that like, that rapid expansion of fame? And as an author, we tend to think of an author as a fairly isolated, solitary figure. Suddenly you're presenting in venues like this. Did you have to construct a public persona as part of that? How did you find that?
I don't think you do it deliberately, but it must happen. Subconsciously, you must create a public persona. And there are a lot of writers that are very shy. Coetzee is a decently shy man. He doesn't come and dance in front of public, like us literary tarts who are so me and Tim Winton and the others. But you must do it automatically. I've never sat down and said, what should I say to engage an audience? Should I say A or should I say B? And that's never been the case. I think because I come from a family that likes talking, and then you come to a literary festival or even a bookshop and read, and people expect good stuff from you. They don't start from a position of hostility. They bring goodwill, and it takes a lot of effort on your part to destroy that goodwill. Now, there was an Adelaide festival once in the early 70s, that I was talking about backstage, to which Ginsberg and Ferlinghetti came, the beat poets. They were invited by Geoffrey Dutton, and they were big-time writers. They were, Australia was still in the 60s fervour, and they were really cool poets, one from San Francisco, one from New York. And this was a stage when it was believed all the sane people were in asylums and all the insane people were running society. And, there was a psychiatrist called Lang.
Oh, yes.
Who had the proposition that... And all the sane people were locked up. And similarly, the real criminals were in outside society, and the people in jail were not criminals. So on that basis, Ferlinghetti and Ginsberg went and got a bloke from the writing class at jail and got him on stage with them at the Adelaide Town Hall for the dinner suit and ball gown evening. And Ginsberg and Ferlinghetti were uncomplimentary enough towards the audience, who were accused of bourgeois turpitude and lack of class consciousness. But the bloke from the jail, all his Christmases had come at once. He could tell them what he really thought. And in those days, you were supposed to be an angry young man. And I felt a few times that I ought to study these blokes. Writers now are much nicer to each other. None of the old knockout. There used to be, brawls at literary festivals, walkouts, hostility, because you were supposed to be you're supposed to be as alienated as you could be. Something. If you didn't feel alienated, it was a sign you didn't have the talent. And so in those days, I didn't feel grossly alienated. I put on a good impersonation. I said I was, Geez, you ought to see how alienated I am. obvious that there are a lot of writers who perform well now, and it's just an extension. We love talking about our books, so if you ask a question about book or writing or the process and so on, we'll pretend to be, oh shucks, I'm too modest to answer this, but really we'll kill you in the rush.
Let's talk about your process then. How does writing work for you? And I know you're talking to the students about this.
Yeah,
today.
the subconscious plays a big part in my writing. I don't intimately plan books. I don't plan what characters will appear in which scene. I don't plan, as I said this morning, I'm more like a Hawaiian navigator going off to find New Zealand at Aotearoa, land of the wrong white crowd, as they say. But no, forgive me, I don't believe that. But in any case, I'm going to find these long canoes, these long divine canoes in the Southeast Pacific. I know from some rumour that they're there. And I set out in a boat with a full cast of characters. The he-men who are going to row, the young warriors who are going to defend us, should we meet the wrong people, the women who are going to grind the grain and do the cooking, the children, because we have to populate these islands if we find them, and we're using dead reckoning, but we don't know if we're quite on the right path. We also don't know what other islands we're going to encounter, what people we're going to encounter, what other canoes we're going to encounter, and whether the whale will come out of the deep and present himself to us. And novels are a bit like that. You know where you're starting and you know where you're going, but you don't know all the details. And you haven't planned it scene by scene. And the reason you haven't is that instinct tells you that the writing will create the scene. Now, there's some writers that can write from start to finish. Graham Greene seems to have been one. But there are others who find out the details of the book, and even in some cases find out what it's about by writing it, by the process of writing. And I think in our subconscious we have all the great stories of humankind. Every Olympian hero and god and goddess, every demigod, every Hindu avatar, every Celtic hero, every Asian monkey god, the whole box and dice of mythology and archetypes we've got in our subconscious. And the process of writing regularly engages the subconscious in the problems of the book and of bringing the novel forward, of getting it, insofar as a novel succeeds, it succeeds because the subconscious has delivered good material to the conscious. So we don't, I thought when I was a kid that writers actually, I think my teachers might have thought it too, that writers were so clever they thought, I'll use a bit of alliteration here, and I'll use a bit of hyperbole here, and I'll bring in a metaphor here, and we'll finish it off with a grand slam simile. But they don't think like all that stuff, all the metaphors, all the variation in the texture of language, it comes intuitively. I'm one of those who are always disappointed by interviews with footballers after the game's over, Aussie rules, or because they can't tell you what happened. We had a wonderful Aboriginal 5'8" called Cliffy Line, about whom I wrote a cantata I used to sing at home called Cliffy Called Me Mate, Mate, Cliffy Called Me Mate. Cliffy, it was bloody great, mate, when Cliffy called me mate, etc. Goes on in that vein. Sadly, I sent it to Peter Sculthorpe. He never used it. But, with Cliffy, they'd interview him afterwards about why he did something and why he put on the moves he did. He could step off both feet, go in all directions, and he knew when there was support and delivered the ball unfailingly. And so they'd interview him. Cliffy didn't know why he'd done it. You'd think he'd be able to. It would take a Yeats to say what he did properly, but Cliffy couldn't explain it because it was too nifty and it was all intuitive. He didn't even quite know what he was doing at the time because it was in him. The move was in him. It wasn't a poem that he wrote and wanted to talk about afterwards. And the same thing with novelists. A lot of people think novelists are bright, but a lot of what they come, and I said this last time I was at the Hawke Centre, so forgive me for repeating myself. It fulfills my wife's prophecy that I only have 3 or 4 ideas and she's heard them all. But you can think that writers get asked their opinion about all sorts of things. And Tim Winton doesn't often, he's very wise. He has a wise reticence about him. Whereas a person with primitive political concepts like myself, again, is all too willing to talk about Australian society and politics without shedding a lot of light. So the writing process involves a lot of time of spending time in the presence of the book and trying to write every day. You should write, my minimum's about 1,000 words, but sometimes it's like hacking it out with a chisel. I've got a book coming out, I hope I've got it coming out. It's about 2 old men dying. And one of them died 42,000 years ago at Lake Mungo, north of Balranald. It's the first ceremonial death we have, the first death in which there were ritual activities went round the burial. And it's in Australia 42,000 years ago. And I've written a book about him, and I've written a book about a modern man, Parallel, a 2-armed book. Parallel, it's how much we have changed, how little we have changed. It's about quests. It's about the fact we say we want a quiet life, but we don't. A lot of us will go to a lot of trouble to ensure we don't have a quiet life. I've been studying Dickens recently, and Dickens' life went downhill when he found happiness with his girlfriend, Ellen Ternan, the young Irish actress. From that point, they used the term actress in those days, that sexist word, so forgive me for using it. But he fell in love and sealed up his bedroom from his wife, who then left him. And his whole family life and even his happiness went to blazes from then on. And it's funny how that's one thing that happens with men of a certain age. If it doesn't happen to you, a lot of men tried as instinctively as salmon trying to leap the rapids, and some of them smash into the rocks. They want the new life, even though the new life will be far more disturbed and disturbing. They fall, in many cases, passionately in love, as Dickens did with Ellen Ternan. But their life is not easy from that point on. For example, they've got an extra family. Ellen Ternan came with 2 sisters and a mother. So Dickens was the last 10 years of his life, Dickens was writing to keep them too. And she was a lovely girl, Ellen Ternan, by all accounts. But that's the story, that's what we're talking about this morning. Dickens couldn't acknowledge her publicly because he was Santa Claus. Every year he wrote a Christmas story. And you can't have Santa Claus in a G-string, you know.
You've managed to work that image in twice today. I like that.
And in any case, that thing of fascinates me, of how we will go on a quest. Some years ago, a friend of mine, Jim Bowler, now about 87, discovered a skeleton in the lunette of Lake Mungo. He knew it was an old skeleton, but he had no idea it was 42,000 years old. And that skeleton, and I believe this, took over his life. That man, that 42,000-year-old man, took over Jim Bowler's life. So he's still on a pilgrimage, a parallel pilgrimage to that man. And I remember someone like Fred Hollows taking up a pilgrimage to institute a system of worldwide eye health, which he's done. He's done it. He's put in place, if people would look at it, the health insurers never will, a system which will cure blindness all over the world. And then I met a Dutch woman who encountered an Australian perfume tree. I'd like to write about her. There's a rare tree from southeastern Australia. I don't think it grows in SA. It definitely grows in the woody parts of Victoria, so probably the Grampians eastward, and it grows in coastal and just over the dividing range forests in New South Wales and Queensland. But it's not a well-known tree in Australia, and she finds this tree and she says what a beautiful smell it has, and it's broad-leafed. She was a biologist. It's broad-leafed, so it's probably got some interesting compounds in it. And she extracted a compound, and she has patented this compound all over the world, so that now she lives like a graduate student. She uses all her money on synthesizing that compound and in testing it in vitro. And her great objective is that it will cure ovarian cancer, in which she worked at Sydney University. But she's been on a pilgrimage for nearly 20 years pursuing this plant, impoverishing herself, being beaten up by lab heads who found that the thing they think they've discovered with her is already patented, being kidnapped by Africans who want her patent. All sorts of stuff have happened to her. And finding that again, finding that tree was the worst thing that could have happened to her in many ways. And yet it's the only thing that could have happened to her. And I'm very interested in people who go on difficult pilgrimages, whether it be on a pilgrimage of love in midlife, or on a, even though it mightn't impress the first partner, the first husband or wife, but it makes for good fiction, you know. Happy marriages are crap in fiction. If we're all nice to each other, there'd be nothing to write about. And yet novelists are great protesters about issues about asylum seekers, issues of people being kind to each other. Even the writers that are monsters that are on about that stuff. And that's because that's where their imagination is. Their imagination is always with the underdog, because the position of the underdog is more dramatic than the position of someone who makes it, or if you're writing about someone who's made it, he's got to be a hair trigger's length away from falling back and becoming a marginal person again. So a lot of the subconscious supplies a lot of what happens in a novel, I think. It supplies eureka moments of, both in science and in the humanities, eureka moments of discovery, the sort of moment we've all felt when you get a cryptic crossword clue out. And the front of your mind straining like crazy at trying to force your brain into providing the answer. Meanwhile, back in some primordial swamp in your subconscious, a swamp you cannot see, there are little clerks and gods, and there are secretaries and immortal maidens coming up with the answer. And suddenly it's there. Those eureka moments, all those answers that are in the subconscious, you've got to sit around and wait for them to come to you. And thus you don't feel in control. And thus the characters are never quite like you planned them. And that's the way I would love to be in control from the start, but it's not.
Listening to you talk then, I mean, that's one of the hallmarks of your work, is that intimacy of character against a big historical event or spectacle, or taking a historical event and making it large and bringing it into common consciousness. Are you aware of that when you're writing, trying to maintain that balance between the enormous research you've done into the event and then finding those intimate character moments?
Oh, yes. Of course, the novel specialises in the salient moment. History specialises in the big moment. In the history of Napoleon and his control over Europe, his extraordinary control, he was the first EU person, actually.
Yes.
He wanted himself to be head of the EU, but in any case, there are many things that matter, but what doesn't matter is that on St. Helena, out in the middle of the Atlantic, there's a little English girl called Betsy Balcom, who ultimately wrote a memoir about her relationship with the emperor. The emperor had fetched up the day after his arrival on the island and said, "Can I stay with you in your granny flat, basically, in your summer house?" And so the family, he resided with the family until his house was ready, and they became his intimates. They became too close to him for ordinary people, for the Tories of Great Britain to consider right. And so ultimately they're chucked off the island. And ultimately still they are sent to where undesirable English are always sent by the high Tories, by Castlereagh and Bathurst and similar people. They are sent to Australia. Australia is a dumping ground for unsatisfactory Northern Europeans. Is a very interesting proposition to me, because I'm writing at the moment of how Charles Dickens' two sons came here because they weren't good at chemistry, and Charles Dickens wrote to the headmaster of his youngest son, I think you can give up Latin with Edward now, because he will not need it in his rough colonial life. There's this little girl, she goes up to see Napoleon, and because it's so difficult for Napoleon to go horse riding, the governor has put restrictions on him. His entourage has put a seesaw in his salon. And she arrives, and Napoleon gets on the seesaw, and she gets on the other end, and they seesaw up and down having a conversation. The seesaw is for the emperor's exercise. And sometimes you wonder about reality, because that's true. There was a seesaw in the house. That which seems the height of absurdity, this little, not so little dumpy Frenchman on one end and an English teenager on the other, seems pure fiction. But thank God, these pure fictions often come from the reality. That's why I suggested this morning, I think I suggested that the kids read voraciously,
yes,
because you never know where the character trait you need for your commandant on Mars, who has been being attacked by a mystery virus which has been brought by a freighter from Mercury. You never know when some of that old stuff's going to be fantastically appropriate. See, with the outside, environment being unsatisfactory for outside exercise, there might be seesaws in the future of Mars. I don't know if this answers your question, though.
Well, I didn't expect to get to seesaws on Mars, but I think one of the things when you're talking as well is...
the marginal incident,
yes,
the marginal people. It's much more interesting to write about the servant than the master, because he's there, he's subject to the master, thus he's subject to history. Things are being done to him, but what does he do to things in return? He has whenever I see one of those Ponzi frock dramas the Brits make, and see the groom taking Mr. Darcy's horse to the stable, I think, what about his love life? What about his girlfriend? Where's he getting his tucker? You know. So I'm afraid I'm not a good Jane Austen person. There's a woman, this is slightly naughty to tell you, but a woman once said to me, the trouble with Jane Austen is that nothing gets wet except Mr. Darcy when he's thrown into a pond. Nice talk for a man my age, but anyhow.
Yeah, trying to bring it back. You've talked about your love of marginal characters particularly, and I'm interested, I suppose, to take the process back a bit to talk about inspiration. We touched on this morning, and a beautiful description you gave of inspiration when you were talking to Nick Brash, and I just want to share it with the audience and then to talk about what inspires you now. And you described inspiration as being like a bird that lands on the railing. There is a couple of weeks' bewilderment at the end of each novel, and these subjects circle above you and then one alights, you said. It's not a very active process in choosing what you're going to write next. It's almost as if one dazzling coloured bird just ultimately decides to land on your railing, and that's the one you give your food to. Tell us where inspiration comes from for you.
Well, it's often story-based. I've only ever written one novel on an idea, and that was the novel on East Africa. It's one of the few ideas I've got of whose paucity my wife complains. It's the idea that famine is always caused by politics, by lack of resources, by resources that governments almost choose will be lacking. And they do so by depriving minorities of roads, of schools, of clinics. And then the famine comes and there's no roads to take food on, even if and there are no trucks to do it. There aren't enough trucks, even if you've got the food to take to them. That book, To Asmara, of which, there's an English company say they're going to make a film out of it, but we've heard that song before. It was based on the idea of politics and famine, politics and famine. As an Eritrean rebel soldier said, I was raised to believe that everything was God's will. But then the Ethiopians of Mengistu came to our village, they bayoneted my pregnant aunt, and they set fire to the granaries, and they took all our goats. And the next day, the Eritrean rebels arrived and said, well, you know, it's not the will. You don't have to sit around waiting for the will of God to save you. You can take action because your present condition was caused by men, not by God. And it was that there's never been, for example, in a liberal democracy, a famine. The famine in British India, which became a scandal for Churchill, Roosevelt took him to task over it, but the people were not, there wasn't representative democracy. It was during World War II as well. So that's the only time I've written a novel based on ideas. Otherwise, it's stories. I abandoned a novel once about an Italian prisoner of war I knew who escaped from Hay and who lived with a red-haired boarding house keeper in Melbourne, on the run himself from the federal police, and she belonged to the Labour right. And he was a phalangist, he was a pro-Mussolini man who had been disgusted by the way his soldiers fought at Bardia, where there was a big surrender, as you know, in 1940, and he thought it was his duty as a good fascist to keep on escaping. He's very northern Italian and aristocratic, and ultimately I couldn't think like a northern Italian aristocrat. So he ended up a Euro communist because he had to live amongst the Calabrians in the Riverina, and he had to adopt the identity of a dead Calabrian. And he had to therefore descend from being this nobleman and this devout right-wing fascist and become a raisin farm labourer wearing a dead man's clothes. And in those clothes he got to Melbourne and he became a Watkins salesman. This would make a great movie, and you can have it if you remember. He was on the loose from Hay prison for more than 6 months. He'd already escaped twice and been found by a federal policeman. And this federal policeman was looking for him all over the place again. So you got to chase. And the federal policeman and he had reunions after the war. He kept on coming back and taking him to dinner. So a good fella. And you can have the chase, and you can also have what's happening to the escaped POW as well. He is fetched up in London. He gets in Melbourne. Sorry, that was a Freudian slip, isn't it? It must be the weather. He fetched up in Melbourne, and he became a Watkins door-to-door salesman. Are any of you so ancient that you remember the Watkins door-to-door salesman? And your father, before he left to work, don't you bloody talk to that Watkins bloke, he's got his eye on you, etc. And they did have that. They had a high romantic success rate, the Watkins. But particularly when they looked like Marcello Mastroianni, as this bloke did. And he was the Watkins door-to-door salesman, you know. Poor girl got married before her husband went to Papua New Guinea. She's at home, lonely, opens the door, and there's Marcello Mastroianni. You don't have... In a novel, you just put ... after that. And so he had a great time in Melbourne, but this red-headed Irish left-winger who ran a boarding house in which he stayed. She got him involved in nicking union ballot boxes. And one night he was stealing a ballot box for her, and the Catholic right-wingers started to beat him up. And he wanted to say, "Hang on, boys, I'm a fascist just like you." Lay off. So that's a story that's a great idea. It's out there. The bloke existed. He was called La Volpe, the fox. He was given a name by the Italians, La Volpe, the fox, for his 3 escapes. And he was, I mean, they used to say, I remember they put the Italians out on the farms. And people said openly, we can put the Dagos out there on the farms because no Aussie girl's going to fall for a dirty, greasy Dago. You know, they didn't ask the question, what if the dirty, greasy Dago looks like Leonardo DiCaprio? What happens then? And there's a whole generation of women who had relationships with Italian POWs. And it's very sad. I wrote a book on that, and you got them calling into radio shows or calling in, my aunt suicided because 5 years after the end of the war, because she never got over Giancarlo. And in any case, there we go. That's the
inspiration.
That was the one that's circling round now that I recommended to the kids. You see, we're the only species of humans around, and there's the mystery of why we are. Did we breed them out? But no, there's not a lot of their DNA in our DNA. There's not a lot of Neanderthal DNA in us. So it looks as though it was a pretty desperate Saturday night that we got together with the Neanderthals. And then there's the question, there's now Neanderthal DNA, and an American-Korean research group are trying to parlay it into some sort of seed from which they will be able to ask women volunteers to give birth to a Neanderthal. Now, isn't that wonderful? My son, the Neanderthal. A Homo sapiens woman. So, you know, I mean, how are you going to send, what sort of schools you're going to send a Neanderthal? I mean, he'll get in the rugby league team, for sure.
You're walking away tonight with 2 story ideas from Thomas Keneally. How good is that? I'm conscious our time for a conversation is coming to an end.
A lot of stories circling around. I've just started one, I should say, that I've been putting off for years on the Dickens boys who were sent to Australia. In the 19th century, as they said in Oscar Wilde's Importance of Being Earnest. Your uncle said at dinner last night, Algernon, that you must choose between this life, the next life, and Australia. So it's interesting that the British betters, our betters, sent their dumb sons here. Dickens saying, you can suspend the Latin, he won't need it in his rough bush life. And thus, the Dickens boys in Australia is a great story in the shadow of Dickens dying. They were both sent here. One was only 15 when he was sent. It's not unconnected to him shedding himself of his family, shedding himself of his dumb relatives, because although his brothers and sisters were scandalous people and hapless people too. And his father was a hapless person on whom Mr. Micawber is in David Copperfield is launched. But he blamed the fact that the 2 boys he sent to Australia were not good at algebra and the classics on his wife. You know, the old, it's very common, and that's what marriage is for. A friend of mine says, marriage is a sacrament devised by God, instituted by God for the apportionment of mutual blame. It's very true. And he was not good to his wife. Not good in an insensitive male way. I mean, he said we were criminally unmatched, unsuitable for each other. But he did beget 10 children. So there must have been moments where they were not criminally incompatible.
You think around number 5, he could have mentioned something. Would have been nice.
Yeah, you would have. Around about 4, you'd say, I don't think we're both getting what we should get out of this. Anyhow, writing about the new Australia as the planet Mars to which the British gentry sent their unsatisfactory sons is something I thought I couldn't do until I started reading some of their letters. And they're so plaintive. They're just lost children like all of us, and I can do a lost child very convincingly. So I'm hoping to write that book, and I'm hoping it'll be but I'm also hoping that this new book that's having editorial problems, the two sides not quite matching each other, I hope that gets published first. But we'll see. I hope they get both get published before death. That'd be nice.
My last question on the craft of writing before we open it up, because I think we need to end with this sense, is how do you let it go? I mean, you've talked a lot about the passion, the inspiration, the ideas, the journey. How do you know when to let it go, and how hard is that?
Well, you know the old saying, novels are never finished, they're always abandoned. And the other literary criticism story, that a novel is a fiction of uncertain length with something wrong with it. So they've all got original sins, just as humans have original flaws in them that are part of their DNA. But basically, you never ask when you finished a novel, is it really finished? You just feel it is. And you also sometimes feel that it's not quite the novel you thought it was going to be, but my next one will. So you're waiting for the next bird to land. All those things play into it, but it is hard. I wrote a book some time ago, and I've specialized since 1994 in writing from a woman's point of view a lot. And I've got a novel of which I'm very proud called Daughters of Mars. And it's written from the point of view of 2 primitive Methodist sisters from the Macleay Valley in New South Wales, where my family's from. And they are World War II nurses, but they're not Madonnas. They have a hell of a fight on their hands. They're nothing like the sort of Madonna-like nurses that our politicians like to bend the knee in a token way before, but they're real women, and they're feminists, though they don't know it. And in it all is a character called Lady Tarleton. I never thought I'd write about the British aristocracy, but she is Rachel Ward's great-granny. In 1911, and she's an interesting character, in 1911 he was made Governor-General of Australia. He was a Tory, and he was a total dunce, but he was married to this magnificent commoner who looked like Rachel Ward, you know, Brian Brown's wife. She only married Brian Brown to get even with the parents. So sort of that's, if you, other races who want to get even with their parents always marry Australians. I've seen it a number of times. But anyhow, Lady Tarleton started the Bush Nurse, and Lady Dudley, rather, was a famous beauty and was a milliner. And he fell for her and married her. And from then on, the British Tories used to say, wouldn't you think Dudley can get his woman under control? but you couldn't. She founded bush nursing. She tried to get a ship out of Andrew Fisher to take it to Northern Australia and start bush nursing, because she saw in the Western Districts of Victoria how women were giving birth. Then World War I starts, and she starts Australian hospitals all over France. And so Lady Tarleton, as the character is, Australian hospital, is very important in the text. Australian Quakers at that time, there weren't a lot, but what an interesting story they made. A lot of them in the medical corps. And so but those girls, you begin writing them, the more you write, the more flesh they take on, not only from you, but from themselves. The more reality they bring on. And it only occurred to me afterwards that the reason they volunteer to become nurses is that they both killed their mother. One has nicked the opium. She's got ovarian cancer, cervical cancer, in 1913. You could always nick, the medical records show that a lot of opium was routinely nicked from the drug cupboard at Kempsey District Hospital. There was a doctor who was a drug addict. So then so they were able to get opiates and to put their dying mother out of their misery. But without knowing it, they both tried to redeem themselves by nursing in the war. And it's not as simple as that. This business of nursing gets more and more complicated. But a lot of that came from the woman in me that I was supposed to have cemented over when I began playing rugby league. I was supposed to be, but we're all at that level. In the subconscious, we're all male and female. We're all male and female to varying degrees in ourselves. And so writing from the point of view of strong women is... in fact, I've got through life by surrounding myself with strong women. They're a bit of a nuisance because they put you in your place all the time. But my wife, my agent, everyone I'm involved with is a strong woman. And my granddaughters, I'm proud to say, are strong women too.
I'd love to talk more about authorial voice, but I'm conscious of giving the people here a chance to ask their questions too. So now's an opportunity. And we have a roving mic that Renee has there. Yes, just down the front.
Now, are you Dr. Zavos? I'm glad we met. You've been on my conscience. Because I called you the other day, and I think the thing is that we're all terrified of death, and so we like to talk. Death is kind of domesticated in a Agatha Christie novel, and otherwise it's something that happens in the lower orders in a Joe Nesbo novel, for example. And this domestication and distancing of death is something that's in it. We're fascinated to read about it, to play with it in the murder story. The only problem with the murder story is that I find is that when you, until the name of the killer is revealed, you have this great, ominous, numinous presence of evil. Someone has killed a child, say, and it is bigger, it fills the evil of that, fills the book. When you attach it to an individual, the caretaker or the gardener or Sir Humphrey or whoever, it becomes far more banal. The crime becomes far more banal. And I don't know how you deal with that letdown. I think that letdown is what drives people to the next murder mystery they're going to read. So I was reading the Steve Larson books, and I hadn't read a detective story before. I started writing a detective story about a gentleman convict who is at Port Macquarie, up near where my family comes from. Port Macquarie was a place of secondary punishment from the 1920s onwards to the 1820s to the 1840s. And the first convict novelist went there, James Tucker, Jesuit-educated boy, but brighter than Barnaby Joyce. And a sad case of a gentleman convict who was persecuted to within an inch of his life. And he was visiting a woman in Parramatta when he was caught by a clergyman magistrate, and he was sent to Port Macquarie just for being out of his district. And it struck me at the time, if you had a detective who was a convict and he had to solve the murder to get his ticket of leave, what pressure would be on him? And that's the basis on which I began writing about 30,000 words of this book. And then I said I've always believed my daughter was a writer. I said to her, would you like to take this on? And we could do, there are so many convict settlements, and I'd already researched a number of them for various books in Tasmania and in New South Wales. A wonderful place. Governor Darling created a penal colony at Wellington, New South Wales, for educated convicts to make sure they got as much punishment as the ordinary punter convict did. And so that's what we did. Now, I've discovered that my daughter has great narrative powers, and she's got great output. So she and I have been writing these together, making up the plots together. She is now writes a lot of the first draft, but I do it with her, meet her occasionally, and we do it computer to computer. And we don't fight, because we've got similar passive-aggressive temperaments that drive my wife mad. You know, she's the sort of stand there and fight, you mongrel, sort of girl. And anyhow, the plotting has to be of a different order than it is for normal fiction. You have to know the plot from the start and who committed the murder. And you have to have as many suspects as possible, of course. And I think we've got better at that since the first one set in Port Macquarie. And we're now up to number 3, which is set in Maria Island. There's great stuff as yet and great movies yet to be made about convicts in Maria. The relationship between Irish convictism and the Democrat Party, Tammany Hall in New York, and them sending agents to break political prisoners out of Van Diemen's Land. Something we're never told about. Smuggling them out disguised as other people. Or in one case, taking the position of a particular convict in bed with an Irish surgeon saying he has a terrible disease, you can't enter, you'll come out in spots if you go near him. Giving the real convict, 10 days in which to make his escape to San Francisco, to begin his escape to San Francisco. So there are great books there, but that's another story. The detective story is a very interesting format, and I think it can be the subject. Dickens thought it could be the subject of serious writing, or the murder mystery, let's say. And I think it can be, too. And you've devoted your life to studying it, you foolish, impressionable boy.
We've got time for one more question. Yes, over here.
I can answer your question out the back later if you like.
You've said that stories and characters take on a life of their own. What happens if you get in the middle of the story and the plot and you hate it? Have you ever met a story you didn't like?
Yeah, yes. You see, it's very like a relationship. You know, you have to have a lot of passion at the start to make a relationship last. You have to build up a sentimental context, in the best sense of the word, for the relationship. Things you can look back on, things you can cling to, mantras that you can even utter when the other person becomes irrational. So as you've got to have a great passion to get a relationship to its natural end, similarly you've got to have a great passion. And then what happens when that Dewey, when you find out that your book is just a book, like when you find out the bloke you married is just a bloke, just another Labrador pup wagging his tail at you, and that is what happens in the novel too, and can happen. It's a real crisis. You should take it lightly rather than too seriously. You can continue writing. If the novel dies under you, it's probably died before you've despaired of it. So if you've despaired of it, it means it's still alive. It hasn't died yet. And there are a number of methods you can use to write your way out. One method is you can dictate anything. But just keep writing. Even if you know it's bad, even if you know it's cheap, even if you know it's not going to be in the final draft. But one writer who's just written an interesting book called Draft Number 4, James McPhee, an American writer who teaches writing at Princeton, he says in this interesting book, it's the best essay I've ever read on writing, actually. He writes, he says, you're writing a book on bears and you've lost faith in the whole project. He's the sort of writer who writes the history of something, the history of bears, or the histories of cod, or the histories of salt, or the history. There was a bloke, he's been to the Adelaide Festival, who used to write the history of salt, and he's an American. Very important history, very ramified. In any case, James McPhee says, write out all the possibilities, basically. He says, write a letter to your mother saying, I have to write a book on bears, the whole history of bears, from the beginning to the end, from their hereditary line to their occupation of the earth pre-human, what the earth was like when they appeared, what happened during the various ice ages that have happened since, what is happening to them now when they're wandering this melting tundra, what is their relationship to humans, what is their relationship to the indigenes of the Arctic, the Inuit and so on. So there are all these places you could start, and you write about them in a letter of complaint to your mother. A letter of complaint that says, this will never be written, there'll never be a documentary series, I won't ever be able to pick up boys or girls at the Toronto Film Festival where the documentary is shown, and I don't know whether to begin it with this. If you write that serious essay about the book, he said you'll find the answer in there, that you will, ideas will generate each other. And if you do enough writing, Maeve Binchy, I quoted this morning, Maeve Binchy, who's the most successful, now deceased sadly, too young, too much weight, and yet it suited her. She was an earth mother. And she said, write 500 words a day. Sometimes it'll feel as if you're writing to your least favourite aunt. Sometimes it'll feel like you're writing to a lover who betrayed you. But just keep writing sequentially for 3 or 4 months, 500 words a day. Keep in touch with the text. Spend time in its over a number of days a week in its presence, even if it's just for a while, because that'll get the creative part of your subconscious, the Eureka moment side of your nature going. And at the end of 4 or 5 months, you're going to have a heap of stuff that you might be able to boil down. So when you despair, don't suicide. There is an interesting process that I don't recommend to you. It involves hangovers that you can... I'm not convinced that hangovers are definitely bad for the health, but they work quite interestingly on the subconscious as well. I suppose they put you closer to it. As the joke says, the difference between a sensitive New Age male and a rabid hoon is 2 schooners. Do you call them schooners in South Australia?
Yes.
Anyhow, so the writer's block, there are ways to get out of it. It's not lethal.
We'll have to draw it to a close there. I want to leave you with an image, though. Earlier today, Tom gave a masterclass for our undergrad students. He's doing another one for our postgrad students on Thursday. And we ran for just over 2 hours, I think it was. And at the end of the masterclass, because we had a number of classes together, we put on pizza, free pizza for the students. The number of students who turned their back on that pizza to stand in queues and talk to you was phenomenal. And I will carry that image with me for some time of pizza cooling as students gathered around you.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Thomas Keneally.
Thank you. Thank you, young man.
Thomas, thank you so much for your wonderful time, generosity, and it's so great to have you back here at the University of South Australia.
It's an honour to be back.
And Hawke Centre too.
Or could I say Jacinta, it's a bloody honour to be back here.
And Jason, thank you very much for participating in this conversation. And so a reminder that the video of this wonderful presentation tonight is available on our Hawke Centre website next week. So please, if you want to relive this lovely moment and also let your friends and colleagues know that that's there for them to look at as well. Thank you again for joining us at the Hawke Centre, and we look forward to seeing you again at one of our wonderful and numerous events that we have coming up. Safe travels home. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.